Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the quiet, dust-scented corridors of an ancient Roman library, a place so hushed you can hear the papyrus crackle when someone shifts their weight. You're standing beneath a colonnaded atrium in the early morning mist, sandals just slightly damp on the mosaic floor as you squint up at the painted ceiling that still holds flecks of sky blue, despite the city's pollution and pigeons doing their best to redecorate. You, dear listener, are not a soldier, gladiator, or senator, not even remotely. You're a lowly but literate soul in a world that doesn't require many of those. You're starting your first day as a junior scribe at a modest public library near the edge of Rome's bustling Forum district. The position pays in bread, olives, and the occasional coin if someone forgets to deduct your ink budget. And while it doesn't sound glamorous, you will one day come to realize it's perhaps one of the softest gigs in the entire empire, as long as you can tolerate the smell of mildew and keep your toga out of the oil lamps. You might think working in a Roman library is all about quiet reflection, sipping watered wine while casually reciting Cicero under your breath, but in truth, you'll spend more time dodging pigeons, organizing scrolls by authors whose names no one can pronounce, and managing the whims of patricians who believe every piece of information should be within arm's reach of their sausage-stained fingers. And let's face it, you probably wouldn't last a day. One sneeze near a sacred text, and you're getting the kind of glare that withers fig trees. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're unwinding. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first impression of the library is that it's darker than expected. The clear story windows were clearly installed, more for architectural pride than actual utility, and someone's forgotten to trim the vine creeping in through the south wall. Still, there's a peculiar charm here. Shelves built into the walls cradle scrolls tied with red, green, and black cords, color-coded by genre, allegedly, although no one seems to know what green actually means anymore. You're handed a reed stylus, a block of wax for practice, and a small jar of ink made from soot and fish glue. Don't ask how you know it's fish glue, you just do. The senior scribe, Lucius, looks like he's part of the original foundation. His beard is long enough to be categorized, and he walks with the deliberate pace of someone who believes every step should be considered twice. He doesn't speak much, just gestures to a pile of scrolls and points to a table that's slightly off balance. Welcome to the job. You sit, adjusting your borrowed tunic, and realize too late that you've placed your hand in a small pool of congealed wax left by your predecessor. There's no sponge in sight, so you discreetly wipe your palm on the underside of the table and hope no one notices. The scrolls themselves are heavier than they look, tightly wound cylinders of papyrus with faintly fragrant cedar end caps. Your task? Copy the script from one to another, letter by painstaking letter, without smudging, abbreviating, or correcting the original. Even when the original clearly says something ridiculous, like, the sun sets 4 times a day. That's not your business. Your job is to replicate, not to question. Still, you quietly mutter under your breath. Maybe the sun does get tired. A rat skitters by the threshold, pausing just long enough to confirm that you are, in fact, unimportant. Somewhere behind you, someone drops a stylus with a clatter that echoes like a cymbal crash in a bathhouse. You startle, then try to look, like you meant to lurch dramatically to the left. Lucius raises an eyebrow, but says nothing. The morning drifts on like a lazy barge on the Tiber. You copy a few lines from a treatise on agriculture, which includes several deeply questionable ideas about goose droppings and soil fertility, followed by an epic poem with so many mixed metaphors it could be classified as soup. At one point, a breeze carries the scent of fresh bread from the nearby bakery, and you think briefly of quitting this job and becoming a baker's assistant. At least they don't get papyrus splinters. But then you glance at the ink bottle, catch the faint shimmer of oily blackness, and feel a peculiar sense of pride. You're part of something. Sure, no one knows your name, and half the scrolls you copy will never be read by anyone other than the guy who checks for copy errors. but there's something oddly noble about preserving words. You wonder how many scribes came before you, quietly, toiling by lamplight, cramping their hands over love letters and tax documents alike. Historians still argue whether the average Roman library scribe was considered a skilled artisan, or just slightly more useful than a particularly intelligent donkey. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The fact that you can read and write in Latin, even if it's mostly in service of recording a wealthy landowner's opinions about grape harvesting, is still unusual. Literacy isn't common outside elite circles, and even among the elite, reading is often outsourced to slaves or secretaries. You occupy a strange, quiet social nook, important enough to be allowed into this space, but not important enough to decide what happens within it. You break for lunch in the shaded courtyard, where a few other junior scribes huddle around a plate of boiled eggs and figs. Conversation is minimal. It's considered bad form to speak too loudly around all these written words. It's said that the gods of knowledge dislike shouting. You nibble on a slightly overripe fig and listen to the wind thread itself through the columns. Somewhere nearby, a tutor is drilling a boy in Greek declensions, his voice rising and falling, in a rhythm that's almost hypnotic. The sun shifts, casting new angles on the mosaic floor. You trace one spiral design with your toe, wondering if anyone remembers the artist's name. Probably not. It's the same with scribes. The names don't stick, the words do. You return to your table and resume copying, ink flowing in tiny rhythmic motions, your fingers developing that gentle ache that signals a full day's effort. There's a comfort in it. Monotonous, yes, but stable. And in a city that runs on chaos, politics, and bread riots, stability is no small thing. As the lamps are lit and the shadows stretch long across the walls, you close your scroll, seal it with a careful loop of red twine, and place it gently in its assigned cubby. You brush your hands off, stand, and stretch your back until something pops. A little victory. One day down, many to go. You take one last look around the room, the quiet shelves, the fading murals, the high window catching a final glint of sunlight. It's peaceful here. You think you might stay a while. The next morning, you arrive earlier than necessary, partly because you're eager to impress Lucius, and partly because you underestimated how long it would take to eat a breakfast of stale bread soaked in watered-down wine while dodging the neighbor's goat. The forum is quieter at this hour, the marble steps still cool to the touch, and the usual symphony of vendors shouting about fish and figs hasn't quite begun yet. You slip through the colonnade and into the library's main hall, which smells like a mix of old ink, damp plaster, and something vaguely smoky, probably the brazier someone forgot to clean. As you step inside, you notice the first change in your scribe routine. You've been entrusted with access to the restricted scrolls. These aren't scandalous or magical texts, at least not in the exciting way you'd hope, but they're valuable, rare, or difficult to replace. Your job is to begin cataloguing them more precisely, since the last person in charge of this task apparently left halfway through a cup of Mulsum and never returned. There's a shelf behind a bronze lattice, locked with a key that Lucius hands, you without ceremony. Inside, the scrolls are older, more fragile, and wrapped in soft linen cloths to keep them from crumbling in the damp Roman air. You gingerly unwrap one, revealing a text by Varro on the origins of Latin words. The handwriting is cramped, each line dancing dangerously close to the one above it. And at the bottom, someone's made a tiny doodle of what looks suspiciously like a donkey in a toga. You smile, then stop yourself. You mustn't smudge the page. It's here, in this corner of quiet reverence, that you begin to understand the scale of what's being preserved. Every smudge, every ink blot, every break in the papyrus holds a story, an imperfection from some scribe centuries ago, scribbling by oil lamp in a villa or temple or government archive. You're part of that lineage now, even if your own doodles have yet to be added. As you begin recording the titles and condition of each scroll, you notice a pattern. Many are works of philosophy, Plato in translation, bits of Aristotle in dubious Latin, Stoic meditations copied and recopied until some, Phrases seem almost comically warped. The soul is a dog, reads one passage, or perhaps a cup. Historians still argue whether this was a translator's mistake or just very early performance art. One scroll, attributed to an obscure thinker named Tullius Maximus, contains an entire essay arguing that sleep is the purest form of civic duty. You pause, reread it, and wonder briefly if you found your spiritual ancestor. The library's organization system isn't entirely clear. Scrolls are grouped not alphabetically, but often by size, material, or the mood of the person who shelved them. You come across one cabinet where epic poetry is stored alongside tax, regulations, and a recipe for something called honeyed fish paste. Lucius wanders by at one point, peering over your shoulder, muttering, "Ah yes, the fish paste scroll. Not to be confused with the honeyed duck appendix. That one's in the next room." You try not to ask too many questions. As the day warms, the light slants differently through the high windows, casting strange geometries on the mosaic tiles. You take a break on the stone bench in the atrium, where ivy curls up toward the sunlight. A stray cat hops up beside you, stretches luxuriously, and decides your lap is now its property. You sit still, afraid to disturb this new deity, and take the opportunity to reflect on how this job, while quiet, is oddly fulfilling. The world outside buzzes with traders, messengers, and soldiers, each locked in the performance of Roman grandeur. But here in the library, the performance is gentler, a performance of memory, preservation, and patience. You're learning more than just how to write neatly. You're learning how to wait, to read between the lines, to find meaning in the scratches and gaps. In the afternoon, you're tasked with assisting a visiting scholar from Antioch who's come to study a scroll of medical remedies. He wears an absurdly large cloak, smells faintly of cinnamon and sweat, and insists on asking questions in both Latin and Greek, sometimes switching mid-sentence. You do your best to keep up, handing him scrolls and carefully turning pages for him when he gestures dramatically with his ink-stained fingers. One remedy recommends crushed emeralds for indigestion. Another suggests humming a specific note, while applying warm goose fat to one's temples. You wonder if anyone has ever tried these remedies unironically and survived. Your guest is polite, but scattered. At one point, he mistakes a shelf of satirical poetry for anatomical diagrams and spends half an hour debating the philosophy of spleens with himself. You quietly copy a few verses while he rambles, just to amuse yourself. They're actually quite funny, poking fun at senators who wear too many rings and priests who snore during their own sermons. The scholar departs just before sunset, leaving behind a scroll accidentally tucked into his satchel and a small jar of what might be saffron, but smells more like powdered sandalwood. You return the scroll to its proper place and note its absence in the catalogue as instructed. Lucius gives you a nod of approval, a rare gesture, and for a brief moment, you feel as if you've passed some unspoken test. That evening, as you light the final lamps and sweep the floor gently to avoid stirring too much dust, you think again about the scroll you found this morning, the one claiming sleep as a civic duty. It lingers in your mind. Perhaps the ancient Romans weren't so different after all. They too craved rest, order, and the soothing rhythm of repetition. You stack your writing tools, stretch your neck, and prepare to step back into the chaos of the street, where a man is loudly selling roasted chickpeas and someone's arguing about chariot parking. But inside, you carry a new stillness. The library has started to shape you, not just in posture, but in thought. Words are heavier than they look. Stories outlast empires. And in your quiet copying, you might just be immortalizing the next ridiculous idea about soul cups and emerald antacids for future generations to chuckle over. You glance once more at the scrolls behind the bronze lattice, now locked and shadowed, their titles glowing faintly with the last light of day. There's still so much to uncover. The next day begins with the steady rhythm of sandals on stone as you make your way once more through the swelling streets of the Roman Forum, your satchel bouncing gently against your hip, and the morning sun already asserting its presence across the tiled rooftops. A baker down the street from the library is shouting about fresh loaves with the fervour of a senator mid-debate. while a boy nearby tries to balance a basket of peaches on his head without tripping over a runaway chicken. You sidestep the chaos with the seasoned grace of someone who now understands that dignity in Rome often comes down to simply not falling over. Inside the library, things begin with an unexpected twist. Lucius is nowhere to be found. In his place, a younger woman named Marcia, whom you've only seen briefly before cataloguing wax tablets in a side room, is now directing the day's assignments. She greets you with a nod so efficient it borders on military, then informs you that today you'll be helping to prepare a small display for a group of visiting provincial governors, an event that happens once every Saturnalia, or whenever someone remembers the library exists beyond record keeping. The display must include not only rare scrolls, but also objects of literary significance. This is how you end up digging through a storage room that smells like damp scroll wrappers, old fig leaves, and regret. At the back of the room, beneath a dented bust of Cicero and a stack of cracked wax tablets, you find a curious item, a bronze stylus believed to have belonged to the poet Catullus himself. Or at least, that's what the attached note claims. Written in Lucius's unmistakable scrawl, definitely Catullus's stylus, probably. You clean it gently, resisting the urge to recite bad poetry to it, and set it aside for the display. Next comes the scroll selection. You're told to choose 3 texts that reflect the breadth of Roman intellectual life, which sounds impressive, until you realize the options include a treatise on celery, a tragic play involving a ghost chicken, and a military manual from the First Punic War that appears to have been annotated by someone who hated boats. Eventually, with Marcia's help, you settle on a medical scroll attributed to Serranus of Ephesus, a portion of Livy's history of Rome, and a fragment of a comedic play from Plautus, which includes a scene where a dishonest fishmonger is punished. With endless poetry readings, you're tasked with writing the tiny plaques that will accompany each scroll, and for this, you must walk the fine line between informative and snooze-inducing. You write, erase, and rewrite several times until your fingers are smudged with charcoal, and your stomach reminds you that it hasn't seen a grape since sunrise. One of your early drafts reads, "This scroll is old. Please don't sneeze near it." Eventually, you settle on something more dignified, and Marcia gives you a rare half-smile of approval before returning to her own preparations. As the governors arrive, robed, perfumed, and flanked by servants who look deeply unimpressed by everything, you are instructed to stand quietly in the corner, ready to explain anything if asked. You're mostly ignored, which suits you fine, until one particularly inquisitive visitor stops to stare at the stylus of Catullus. He picks it up, turns it over, and asks you whether Catullus was left-handed. You blink. You do not know. No one knows. Historians still argue whether Catullus ever even held a stylus, since much of his work was dictated. But you smile gently and say, "It depends on the poem," which seems to satisfy him. After the tour, when the visitors have shuffled out, leaving behind a few oily fingerprints and one discarded olive pit near Livy's scroll, Marcia invites you to the scriptorium, a quieter chamber not usually open to junior scribes. It is here that the most delicate copying work is done. This is the heart of the library's preservation effort, where scribes with steady hands and steady minds recreate aging scrolls onto fresh papyrus or parchment. You're shown how to prepare a writing surface, how to mix ink from soot and resin, and how to measure margins so precisely it would make a geometry teacher weep with joy. Today, your task is simple. Copy a short philosophical text from Cleanthes, the Stoic, whose meditations are oddly poetic for someone who thought feelings were suspicious. You work slowly, carefully, the rhythm of the letters almost meditative. Live according to nature, Cleanthes advises, though you're fairly sure he never had to do so while swatting flies off his inkpot. The room is peaceful, its silence, broken only by the occasional scratch of stylus against parchment, and the soft hum of a clerk practicing vowel sounds under his breath. The windows are small, letting in just enough light to work without glare, and the air carries the faintest scent of lavender, possibly from the ink, or possibly from someone's attempt to mask the smell of old goat hide. As you settle into your work, You feel something shift inside you. Not dramatic, just a quiet deepening of the sense that you belong here. This isn't the glamorous life of an orator or the battlefield glory of a centurion, but it's something quieter, slower, and perhaps longer lasting. These scrolls might survive centuries. Your copied lines, careful and neat, could be read by someone 100 years from now, wondering who you were and whether you really believed the soul could be purified by suffering. You pause at one line that reads, "The wise man keeps his sandals in good repair." You're not sure if that's literal or metaphorical, but either way, it's oddly comforting. Just before the day ends, Lucius finally appears, looking tired but satisfied. He glances over your work, nods silently, and then says, "You'll assist in a restoration tomorrow. That's real work. Be ready." He leaves without elaboration, but you're left with a strange, excited flutter in your stomach. You gather your things as the shadows lengthen across the library floor. Outside, Rome continues its noisy waltz of life and dust and ambition, but inside, the scrolls rest peacefully, wrapped and shelved, carrying thoughts that refuse to die. And now, a few of those thoughts bear your handwriting. The next morning arrives not with the crow of a rooster, but with the gentle but unmistakable thud of a scroll hitting the floor near your cot. Lucius's preferred method of announcing your assignments, apparently. You sit up, blinking at the dust motes swirling through a beam of golden light, and unroll the scroll with a groggy yawn. 3 words greet you: restoration, be punctual. And so, after a quick rinse and a bit of bread dipped in watered-down wine, you find yourself reporting to a lesser-known chamber of the library, known simply as the Vault. It's cooler here, beneath thick stone arches, and the air carries that ancient papery scent you now associate with home. Restoration is not glamorous. It doesn't involve reading aloud to emperors or uncovering lost poems. It involves hunching over fragile, brittle materials and trying not to sneeze on history. Lucius greets you without looking up from the scroll he's examining, motioning to a bench beside him. Before you sits a cracked and barely legible parchment, once part of a larger work attributed to Varro, a Roman scholar who apparently wrote everything from etymologies to farming advice with equal flair. This particular piece appears to be a section on the medicinal properties of lentils, which feels very on brand for the library. Your job today is to re-ink faded portions using a delicate brush and an absurdly steady hand. First, though, you're taught how to make the ink, a mixture of lampblack soot, gum arabic, and a little vinegar, stirred in a shell until it smells like smoky salad dressing. You apply it slowly, carefully, tracing over the faint Latin characters until they regain some of their former boldness. Lucius reminds you not to improve the lettering, no matter how tempting it is to add a little flair to an R that's had a rough few centuries. As you work, he shares stories, some real, some possibly invented, about the scrolls housed in this section. One, he claims, was smuggled out of Alexandria by a monk disguised as a fishmonger. Another was supposedly used to prop up a short-legged statue of Julius Caesar until someone realized it was a first-edition copy of Cicero's letters. Historians still argue whether that story's true, Lucius says, eyes twinkling. But it's just believable enough to keep repeating. The hours pass in a quiet rhythm. Brush, breathe, stretch your fingers, adjust your posture. Occasionally, Lucius leans over to inspect your work and grunt approvingly. You are allowed exactly 1 fig as a reward before being moved to the next. Scroll, a Greek manuscript possibly brought to Rome by a travelling philosopher, its margins covered in doodles of turtles. You restore each letter like it's a prayer, silently marvelling at the sheer weight of all this preserved knowledge. Most people think of Roman history in terms of emperors and wars and crumbling marble columns. But here, beneath the cities, noise and heat is the quieter story, the one written in faded ink, carefully copied words, and the occasional smudge of olive oil where someone read during lunch. By midday, your back aches in places you didn't know had muscles, and your eyes feel like raisins. Lucius finally calls for a break, and you step outside into the courtyard, where the sun slants gently across mosaic tiles, depicting the 9 muses, each with her signature accessory. You sit beside Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, who seems to understand the existential weight of lentil scrolls. You nibble at a bit of cheese and eavesdrop on a pair of clerks debating whether a recently discovered scroll fragment is part of Ovid's Lost Medea. Could be, says one, but it references a camel wearing sandals. Artistic license, the other replies. You don't weigh in. Instead, you close your eyes and let your thoughts drift. The truth is, life in the library is made up of moments like this. Quiet, peculiar, sometimes absurd, but always oddly meaningful. After your break, Lucius assigns you a new task: repairing a scroll's damaged edge using papyrus patches. This involves trimming tiny strips, aligning them with the grain of the original material, and adhering them with a glue made from flour and water. It's a bit like performing surgery on something that died peacefully 500 years ago. While you work, Lucius tells you about a scribe who once tried to sneak his name into every scroll he copied by shaping the letter M just slightly differently, a subtle vanity, like the literary version of signing bathroom graffiti. They caught him eventually, Lucius says, and reassigned him to nothing but tax ledgers for the rest of his career. Even his handwriting turned bitter. You smile, but you also check your own lettering, just in case. By the time you finish restoring 3 scrolls, the day is slipping toward evening. Your hands are stained with ink, your back is protesting, and your brain feels like it's been wrapped in damp parchment. Still, there's something satisfying about the way those scrolls now lie flat, patched and proud, like old men in new togas. Lucius gives you a small nod of approval, the Roman equivalent of a parade in your honor, and tells you to leave the last scroll for tomorrow. As you gather your things, you spot Marcia in a nearby chamber, her fingers tracing the raised carvings on an old tablet with reverent precision. She glances up and nods. For the first time, it feels like you are no longer just a guest in this world of scrolls and whispers. You belong. Outside, the sun is dipping low behind the rooftops, casting long golden lines across the cobblestones. Rome buzzes in the distance, unaware of your quiet triumphs. But as you walk home, past the bakery with its perpetual cloud of flour, past the alley where someone is trying to sell a goat that clearly doesn't want to be sold, you carry with you the knowledge that today you helped keep the past alive, one restored line at a time. You return the next morning with a soreness that makes you walk like a retired gladiator, but with an oddly buoyant sense of purpose tugging at your sandals. The library has begun to feel like an old friend with strange habits. Always quiet, but never boring, full of peculiar corners and half-finished stories. Today's assignment doesn't take you to the scroll restoration vault again, though Lucius does nod at you approvingly as you pass. Instead, you're sent to assist in what is known as the Catalogarium, a long, colonnaded room where a team of scribes, readers, and administrators attempt the impossible: to organize all known written knowledge without the help of color-coded tabs or alphabetized databases. Your guide for the day is Gaius Flavius Maximus, not as impressive as his name suggests. He's younger than you expected, wears his tunic slightly crooked, and seems to perpetually misplace his stylus. Gaius begins the day by explaining the principles of cataloguing Roman scrolls. You see, he says while chewing the end of a reed pen, we sort them by topic, then by author, then by something called relative importance, though nobody can agree what that means. He gestures to a shelf of astronomy scrolls, one of which includes a dubious claim that the moon is made of condensed wind. That one's been here for years. No one dares throw it out. Your task today is to help Gaius update the scroll registry, a giant wooden tablet engraved with lines upon lines of titles, authors, and shelf locations. This is done not with ink, but by carefully scraping and recarving new lines into soft, wax tablets first, before committing them to wood. It's tedious, yes, but oddly meditative. For every scroll you hold, unroll, and examine, there is a feeling of stepping into someone else's mind for a moment, Here's a forgotten treatise on cabbage farming written by a senator during his exile. There's a poetic dialogue between a dolphin and a fisherman, attributed to a possibly fictional author named Mango. You're not sure whether to feel enlightened or concerned. Every now and then, a debate erupts between two catalogers about where a particular scroll belongs. One insists that a long scroll titled "On the Proper Wearing of the Toga" should be shelved under philosophy, while another argues it belongs in satire. A third claims it should go under fashion, which isn't even a real category yet. Historians still argue whether toga styles actually denoted class or were just passing fads. Gaius mutters, as he reluctantly writes it down under miscellaneous. You suspect that miscellaneous is where 70% of all scrolls eventually end up. Mid-morning, a dignified-looking man with a laurel wreath enters the room and demands to know why his newly donated scroll on dream interpretations hasn't been shelved yet. Gaius gives him the patented catalogarium shrug, equal parts apology and indifference, and promises it will be prioritized. Once the man leaves, Gaius whispers that this happens at least twice a week. Apparently, writing scrolls no one reads, and then demanding they be stored prominently is a Roman tradition right up there, with bad poetry and public baths. Your favorite moment of the day comes when you're asked to retrieve a scroll from one of the upper alcoves. You climb a shaky ladder, reach for the assigned number, and accidentally knock loose an old scroll tucked behind a clay jar. It falls, open to reveal an incredibly detailed guide to Roman street games, complete with stick figure illustrations and what appears to be the earliest recorded insult competition. You bring it down and show Gaius, who laughs so hard he nearly chokes on his own spittle. "I thought this was lost. We used to read this as kids. The game with the wax pebbles and the chicken bones. It's all here." He insists on reading, several passages aloud, dramatically voicing both children and chickens, until the entire room is wheezing with laughter. It's a rare moment of levity in a job usually dominated by squinting and sneezing, and you cherish it. As the scroll is returned to its rightful place, entertainment, subcategory, childhood, Gaius makes a small flourish in the registry, marking it with a special symbol, half moon and squiggle, that he claims denotes scrolls that may cause laughter-induced injuries. He winks, and you can't help but grin. The pace slows after lunch, which is taken in a shaded courtyard where scribes and catalogers eat quietly, muttering about shelf space and ink shortages. Your meal consists of cold chickpeas, a wedge of cheese, and a slice of honeyed bread that sticks to your fingers. You share a bench with a woman named Octavia, who specializes in tracking missing scrolls. She has a face like a hawk and an uncanny ability to remember every scroll location, even the ones that were last seen during Emperor Claudius's reign. "Once," she says between bites, "I found a 1st century treaty on goat taxation being used as a cutting board in the kitchen annex. Still legible, mind you. You don't know whether to laugh or cry, so you just nod solemnly. Back inside, the air is cooler and heavier. Gaius asks you to help organize a batch of newly copied scrolls, all written by hand by young scribes from the northern provinces, whose Latin is ambitious. Some mix up terra, earth, and terra, terra, resulting in one philosophical scroll beginning with the unforgettable line, "All life springs from terra." You gently correct the error and wonder what kind of education those scribes received up in the misty provinces. One of the last scrolls you handle that day is a weathered piece titled "The Humours of the City Sewer," an inquiry. It reads like the world's most dedicated complaint letter, describing the olfactory horrors of Rome in prose so vivid you can practically smell it. It's oddly beautiful in its honesty, though, and you find yourself admiring the unknown writer's commitment to capturing life as it was, even if that life stank. As the lamps are lit and the shadows lengthen, the catalogarium begins to empty. Gaius thanks you with a half hug and a whispered promise to reserve the chicken bone game scroll for you if you ever need a laugh. Octavia nods at you over a pile of scrolls, her eyes already scanning titles. You head out into the twilight with scroll dust on your tunic, and the faint impression that you've just spent a day wandering through the edges of forgotten genius. As you pass the entrance, Lucius is there, talking to a young scribe who looks terrified. He gives you a rare nod and says, "Back tomorrow?" You nod. Yes, of course. You wouldn't miss it. You're beginning to notice something peculiar about the library, now that you've spent several days wandering its halls, breathing its powdered air, and thumbing your way through scrolls that probably haven't seen daylight since Nero last fiddled. It's not just a place of knowledge, you realize. It's a living creature with moods and secrets, like a cat that's half asleep, but still watching you. This morning begins with a minor disaster. As you arrive, early and slightly less groggy than usual, the entrance atrium is in mild chaos. Apparently, during the night, a shelf collapsed in the botany section, sending hundreds of herbal scrolls, fluttering like dry leaves onto the mosaic floor. Lucius, ever the picture of calm disapproval, has deployed a team of scribes and junior librarians to salvage the mess before any senators arrive and notice that their tax-funded institution looks like a trampled vineyard. You're quickly roped in to help triage the situation. You crouch beside a shattered clay tagine that once held rare Egyptian papyrus, its fragments now scattered between scrolls titled "The Medicinal Power of Fig Sap" and "Why Lettuce May Be Cursed." You gently retrieve a scroll with crushed edges, its ink still faintly fragrant with rose oil, and carefully lay it on a flat board, mimicking the preservation technique you saw Lucius perform earlier in the week. As you work, one of the scribes nearby groans, holding up a crushed scroll covered in dark smudges. "This one's about leeches," he says. "Why is it always leeches?" You glance over. The scroll's title roughly translates to "On the Proper Placement of Leeches in Cold Seasons," which raises more questions than it answers. Historians still argue whether such detailed medical texts were genuinely used in practice or were more like speculative medicine, the scribe says, in an exaggerated scholarly tone, clearly mocking the kinds of debates Lucius and his ilk often have during lunch. You stifle a laugh. Once the botany section has been mostly reassembled, with scrolls propped back into their niches and labels rewritten where necessary, you're sent to assist in a place you hadn't yet explored, the Marginalia alcove. It's a shadowy corner, near the eastern portico, used to house scrolls and wax tablets that have been heavily annotated by previous readers. These are not the pristine masterpieces of philosophy or poetry, but the messy, lived-in materials where readers long gone have scribbled arguments, drawings, sarcastic commentary, and sometimes what look like shopping lists. Your job, according to the extremely thin and extremely irritated senior scribe assigned to this zone, is to sort through a crate of such marginalia scrolls and flag any useful notes. Useful is a word he uses with disdain, as if you're more likely to find rude drawings of politicians than actual insights. He's not entirely wrong. One of the first scrolls you open, a legal document concerning the ownership of fishing rights along the Tiber, is covered in childish doodles of boats, fish with human faces, and something that might be a senator falling overboard. Another scroll, supposedly a sacred hymn, includes a long note written in red ink in the margin. Who let this rhyme pass for poetry? You begin to suspect that ancient Rome had its own version of internet comment sections. Still, there are moments of surprising value. You find a worn philosophical text with commentary that actually improves the meaning of the original. Sharp observations added in a narrow, curling script by someone who clearly understood the subject. A debate unfolds in the margins as if two scholars had shared the same scroll over decades, each responding to the other's points like a long-distance academic feud. You can't help but feel a strange intimacy with these voices from the past, their arguments as fresh and passionate as any modern-day dissertation defense. Gaius stops by later to check in, and chuckles when he sees you covered in dust and muttering over a scroll about dream analysis that contains a note reading, "This author clearly has never dreamed anything more exciting than warm porridge." He tells you that once, an early librarian had to remove a scroll entirely from the archive because the marginalia became more famous than the actual content. Imagine writing something so dull, he says, that every reader just writes a better version in the margins. Midday, you head back out for lunch, this time joining a small group of scribes seated around a cracked marble fountain. The Conversation shifts to a recent incident where a pigeon flew into the astronomy chamber and disrupted a lecture on eclipses by defecating directly onto the section labelled Heavenly Shadows. A sign from the gods, one of them jokes. Or just a very opinionated pigeon. After lunch, you're summoned unexpectedly to the librarian's office. Not Lucius, but the head curator, Marcus Drusus Calvus, a man with a beard so geometrically trimmed you wonder if he uses a stencil. His office smells like cedar and roasted figs, and the walls are lined with scrolls arranged with unnerving precision. He asks if it's true you found the lost scroll of Roman children's games in the Catalogarium. When you confirm it, he nods slowly, then pulls out a document you've never seen before. A request from a visiting Greek scholar asking to view unusual Roman pastimes. It seems your instincts are sharper than expected, he says. And just like that, you're given a new role, temporary liaison to visiting scholars. You don't know whether to feel honoured or just extremely underqualified. Your first task in this new position is simple enough. Help prepare a viewing session for a group of Egyptian philosophers due to visit in 2 days. They've requested access to scrolls on Roman religious festivals, but with an emphasis on public rituals rather than private worship. You begin scouring the Catalogarium index and end up back in the marginalia alcove, looking for specific scrolls with useful notes. That's how you find it. A nearly forgotten scroll titled The Feast of the Nine Flames, annotated by what seems to be an eyewitness, complete with commentary on the smell of burning herbs, the poor quality of the musicians, and the amusing moment when a toga caught fire and no one noticed for a full minute. You can't help but smile as you copy out the key annotations and pass them along to the head curator. He actually cracks a smile, which you're told is rarer than a punctual senator. As the day winds down and the sun casts golden rays across the floor mosaics, you realize how much you've begun to enjoy this chaotic, scribble-covered corner of the library. It may not hold the pristine elegance of the philosophy vaults or the grandeur of state records, but it's alive in a way those places aren't, full of laughter, snark, and the human fingerprints of history, quite literally. When Lucius passes, you at the end of the day, and sees the scroll of marginalia still in your hands, he raises an eyebrow. "Be careful," he says dryly. "Those margins are more addictive than wine." You nod, already wondering what tomorrow's margins will reveal. The next morning arrives draped in that same sleepy Roman haze, light filtering through gauzy clouds, birds squabbling like petty politicians, and you trudging through the side courtyard of the library with a basket of fresh parchment strapped to your hip like some scholarly delivery donkey. Your new task as temporary liaison to visiting scholars means less time playing hide-and-seek with marginalia and more time corralling foreign academics who have very specific requests and very little patience. Today, it's the Egyptians. A small but dignified delegation from Alexandria has arrived, led by a stoic man named Heron, who speaks Latin like he's chewing gravel. He carries with him an air of polite disdain, as though every scroll in the Roman collection is a pale imitation of something better housed in the great library back home. You're assigned to assist him in locating any documents on public Roman festivals, with particular interest in how spectacle and ritual overlap. Apparently, he's working on a treatise about how religion controls public behavior. No pressure? Obviously. You begin with a scroll titled On the Lupercalia and its Sacred Goats, which contains a vivid account of half-naked young men running through the streets and gently whipping women with strips of goat hide to promote fertility. Heron raises an eyebrow, mutters something in Greek that probably isn't complimentary, and scribbles in his notes. Historians still argue whether the whipping was symbolic or genuinely believed to cause pregnancy, you offer diplomatically, and he shrugs like that's mildly interesting but still not worth getting excited over. Next you present the Saturnalia accounts of Senator Decimus, which describes days of feasting, slave masters swapping roles, and enough wine to float a trireme. This one earns a slight nod from Heron, who mumbles something about inverted hierarchies. You try to explain how Saturnalia often blurred the line between order and chaos, that it allowed society to blow off steam in a controlled setting, like a ceremonial riot with snacks. Heron finally cracks what may be the faintest smile, though it's hard to tell beneath his elaborate moustache. By midday, you're exhausted. Not from walking, but from the high-wire act of cultural diplomacy. Heron has questions about the crowd control measures at gladiator games, the frequency of priestly oracles during eclipses, and whether Roman augurs ever faked omens for political reasons. You try to answer, but many of these subjects are mired in conjecture. Historians still argue whether augury was more theatre than theology. You offer again, and Heron seems satisfied, though he does mutter something about stage-managed spirituality. He departs in the late afternoon with a stack of copied scrolls and a curt nod of thanks. Lucius appears 5 minutes later, just long enough to hand you a honey cake and say, "Good job not offending Egypt. That's harder than it looks." With the Egyptians gone, you return briefly to your old haunt in the marginalia alcove, hoping to unwind with some sarcastic commentary from the past. You find a scroll labelled "On Proper Dining Etiquette at Religious Feasts" and begin reading. Notes left by a clearly disillusioned priest, who seems particularly upset that no one washes their hands between libations. A divine ritual, he writes in one margin, should not smell like fish sauce. You chuckle, then stumble across an odd phrase scrawled near the bottom. "Beware the forked candle. Twice it burned, twice it lied." It's cryptic and possibly meaningless, but intriguing enough to make you copy it into your notebook. Just as you're about to dig deeper, a sharp voice calls your name. It's the head curator, again. Apparently, a small mix-up in the archive has resulted in a scroll about sewage maintenance being sent to a poet requesting love elegies. You're dispatched to smooth it over. The poet in question is Flavia Domitilla, a noblewoman with a reputation for dramatics and a fondness for metaphors that involve rivers. She is not amused. "Instead of passion, I got plumbing," she announces to the entire reading room. You apologize profusely, retrieve the correct scroll, and leave her to craft sonnets about aching hearts and melting wax. As you shuffle back, Lucius catches up with you and mutters that this is why the library still uses physical scrolls instead of some newfangled codex system. "People need to see what they're holding," he says, "or they'll end up mistaking sewage for sonnets." That evening, you're invited to a symposium being hosted by the library in honor of visiting scholars, and although your sandals are dusty and your toga slightly creased, you go. The symposium takes place in the upper terrace under a canopy of olive branches and torchlight. Tables are scattered with wine, figs, olives, and little cheese-filled pastries that are either delicious or possibly fermented. A philosopher from Athens gives a short lecture on the ethics of silence in public spaces, which turns into a debate about whether sneezing during a speech counts as dissent. Someone else insists that it depends on whether the sneeze was sarcastic. The wine flows, the stars emerge, and for a moment, you forget that you spent your morning passing fertility rituals and diffusing international scroll diplomacy. Gaius finds you near the fig platter and clinks cups. "You realize you've been here long enough to become interesting," he says. "Most apprentices disappear after a week. They get bored or overwhelmed. But you're turning into one of us." It's not quite a compliment, but it's close enough to make you feel oddly proud. You sip your wine and stare out at the flickering lights of Rome, thinking of everything you've read, held, and barely understood. Somewhere down in the catalogarium, another scroll probably just misfiled itself, and someone's going to read about brickmaking when they were hoping for romantic odes. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? This massive, scroll-filled beast of a building doesn't just preserve knowledge, it rearranges it, reinterprets it, and sometimes serves it with a side of accidental comedy. Before the night ends, you find yourself back in the catalogarium, for no real reason, standing amid its silent racks like a visitor in a forest of sleeping ideas. You pull one scroll at random and crack it open, half expecting more leech instructions or passive-aggressive marginalia. But instead, it's a soft, poetic musing about the feeling of twilight in the city, the sounds, the smells, the slow hush that falls like a blanket. The author is anonymous. The ink is faded. But the words hum with something you recognize, the stillness of a mind reaching out through time. You smile, and quietly, reverently, you re-roll the scroll and return it to its place. You wake up the next morning with the lingering aftertaste of overripe figs and philosophical paradoxes stuck somewhere between your molars, your mind still half draped in olive-scented dreams from last night's symposium. Despite the haze, the moment your sandals scrape against the mosaic floor of the library's entry hall, the familiar cool of the marble underfoot resets your senses like a gentle slap from a scroll. Today's task is deceptively simple. Reorganize the rhetoric and oratory section in the West Wing. On paper, this just means shifting scrolls, but in reality, it's more like wrestling an octopus made entirely of ego, because Roman orators apparently couldn't write a single speech without declaring themselves the saviors of the Republic or inventors of language itself. The scrolls aren't just long, they're boastful, melodramatic, and occasionally hostile to anyone attempting to alphabetize them. You begin with Cicero, naturally, the cornerstone of Roman rhetorical swagger. But his scrolls have been annotated to death. Commentaries written upon commentaries, some in surprisingly spicy Greek. You come across one marginal note that reads, Cicero again, talking just to hear himself echo. You snort quietly. Historians still argue whether Cicero's verbosity was strategic or just unchecked self-love. But after sorting through 12 nearly identical speeches on the ideal, Roman citizen, you're inclined to believe the latter. Eventually, you fall into a rhythm. Slide, unroll, squint, categorize, repeat. Lucius swings by with a smirk and says, "Don't get too inspired. We don't need another apprentice giving speeches to the ficus tree." You smile, but then actually imagine it. The ficus as a silent senate. You declaiming with grand gestures, "O noble foliage, may your shade never wither." Maybe you've inhaled too much scroll dust. Around midday, you discover a small cluster of scrolls misfiled behind the shelf. Forgotten speeches by lesser-known orators like Publius Cluvius Rufus, who specialized in legal arguments involving goats. One speech in particular captures your attention. A passionate defense of a goat accused of ruining a senator's toga by staring at it with demonic intent. It's both absurd and weirdly poetic, and you find yourself reading it aloud under your breath. The speech ends with, "If the beast's eyes hold malice, then let us also try the stars for their twinkling deceit." You decide to keep this, scroll aside, thinking it might be a fun addition to the marginalia alcove. Surely someone left a comment or two on it. You're not disappointed. A furious note reads, "This man was clearly paid in cheese." Another simply says, "No goat ever cared this much." You chuckle, then nearly trip over a visiting senator's nephew sprawled out on the floor, studying, by sleeping on a cushion of bound papyrus. His tutor glares at you like it's your fault the child is a human doorstop. You apologize and keep moving. After a long afternoon of shelving and sorting, you finally retreat to the curator's office to log your progress, only to find that the wax tablet system used for recording scroll locations has inexplicably decided to list all authors by their second names, which would be fine, except when you try to find Cicero under Marcus, you get cross-referenced with a baker's inventory list for the Senate kitchens. Somewhere, a librarian is crying, probably you. You begin painstakingly correcting the tablet entries, grumbling quietly about how the future better invents something with paper and ink and page numbers, or civilization is doomed. Halfway through, Lucius brings you a cup of watered wine and an apology. Apparently, he says, the senator's nephew tried to eat a scroll and blamed you for making history taste too bland. You both agree that this is a new career low, but the curator doesn't scold you. Instead, he commends your persistence in the face of papyrus-induced madness and assigns you to a new task, reviewing the personal journals of past librarians. You try not to show how excited that makes you. These aren't official records. They're dusty little scrolls filled with thoughts, complaints, jokes, and strange little observations that never made it into formal histories. The first is by a librarian named Aelia, who served 40 years ago and seemed to have an intense dislike for silence. "If quiet were truly golden," she writes, "I'd melt it down and shout at it." You relate immediately. She also has pages devoted to suspicious behavior by a colleague who may or may not have been hoarding wax figurines shaped like senators. Then there's Cassianus, who kept meticulous records of the sounds people made while reading. Sniffles, snorts, ill-timed sneezes, and what may have been a whispered ode to a bread loaf. These journals aren't official history, but they're real. Messy, personal, a bit ridiculous, and they breathe with the everyday life of a place most people imagine as still and sterile. You spend hours poring through them, laughing, frowning, occasionally touched by small, intimate moments, like Cassianus describing how he comforted a blind reader by narrating epic poems aloud, or Alia's admission that she once wrote fake scroll titles just to confuse an annoying senator. It's not exactly what you'd call educational, but it's far more instructive than most lectures you've attended. Historians still argue whether these kinds of personal records count as valuable primary sources or mere curiosities. But to you, they feel like the library whispering back. You end your day returning those journals to their secret compartment behind a statue of Minerva, the same one where you once found that lost scroll about toad-fat remedies. The library's quirks are starting to map themselves in your memory. Now, you know which corridor echoes too much, which wax tablets are sticky, and which shelf creaks like it's about to confess to a murder. As the sun dips low and Rome's rooftops turn gold, you sit near the western window and watch the pigeons hold their nightly war council. A breeze rustles the olive branches just beyond the wall. You lean back, surrounded by ink, dust, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, you're beginning to belong here. The library no longer feels like an ancient beast you're trying to tame. It feels more like a sleepy companion, grumpy but generous, forgetful but wise, always ready to tell you. One more weird little story before bed. You wake a bit later than usual the next morning, your bones aching in that pleasant way that only comes after a long day of quiet victories, categorizing ancient egos, outwitting misfiled tablets, and chuckling at long-dead librarians who hated silence more than most people hate tax season. As you shuffle into the library's main hall, you're greeted not by the usual hum of readers and the shuffle of sandals, but by complete, cathedral-like silence. It's unsettling. Turns out, there's an inspection today. Yes, the very same kind of Roman bureaucratic check-in that has the power to turn your peaceful, scroll-sorting paradise into a political circus. A senator's aide, draped in far too much purple for someone with no real power, has arrived to review intellectual integrity and catalogue purity, which basically means making sure no erotic poetry has snuck its way into the history of agriculture, and that no one has drawn anything scandalous on the margins of Julius Caesar's war commentaries. You're assigned to follow the aide around with a wax tablet, pretending to take notes while secretly counting how many times he mispronounces Herodotus. Within 15 minutes, the tally is up to 6, and that's only because he hasn't ventured into the Greek section yet. Your colleague Lucius trails behind with a face so carefully blank, it looks like he's been sculpted by someone who hates joy. The aide pauses at one particular scroll labelled Dramatic Histories of Minor Cities and arches a skeptical eyebrow. "What use is this?" he mutters, clearly unaware that it includes the only surviving account of a goat-led siege in a forgotten town near Hispania. You begin to explain, but he waves a lazy hand. Replace it with something practical, perhaps agricultural yields. You jot that down, but your wax tablet simply reads, "Idiot wants goats replaced with wheat." You resolve to erase it later, but you secretly don't. Historians still argue whether these bureaucratic inspections were genuinely aimed at preserving moral order or just convenient excuses for Rome's elite to peacock around libraries while pretending to care about scrolls they'll never read. Whatever the reason, today you get to watch grown men panic over whether someone shelved a risque love poem in the geography section. Things hit a new low when the aide demands proof that none of the librarians have been embedding coded political critiques into fictional texts. "You mean satire?" Lucius asks, his voice a deadpan miracle. The aide doesn't answer. He's too busy peering at a scroll like it just insulted his lineage. To lighten the mood, you offer a small, dry fact. The scroll he's holding is actually a long, extremely dull treatise on Roman bridge construction techniques in flood-prone regions. He pretends to understand and nods seriously. You realize he's holding it upside down. After a few more agonizing hours, the inspection wraps up. The aide makes a few vague comments about needing to streamline intellectual priorities and leaves behind a list of recommended removals. Among them, the entire shelf labeled Dreams and Omens in Battle, which he calls nonsense. You and Lucius exchange a glance. That shelf is a favorite among visiting gladiators, philosophers, and people who believe they once saw Mars in a puddle. You decide not to remove anything, just relabel it something safe-sounding, like symbolic cognitive preparations for tactical engagement. It works. No one checks twice. With the inspector finally gone, the library exhales. You can practically hear the shelves groan in relief. Lucius slumps into a reading cushion and declares he needs 3 fig cakes and a lie down. You offer him a half-stale honey biscuit from your tunic pocket, which he accepts like a man on the edge. To unwind from the day's madness, you head to the rarely used upper alcove known as the Pessimist's Gallery. It's a collection of scrolls by famously grumpy philosophers, Cato the Elder, who believed everything had already gone wrong by the time he was born, Seneca's crankier students, and even a few anonymous authors whose only contribution to Roman thought was, nothing matters and figs are too soft. One scroll in particular catches your eye, an unsigned piece titled Concerning the Futility of Shoes. It's a tirade against the idea of footwear, claiming that toes deserve freedom and that sandals are a mark of weakness. You read the whole thing in stunned amusement and wonder whether it was written sincerely or as a joke. Historians still debate whether these more absurd treatises were legitimate philosophy or merely boredom disguised as deep thought. Either way, it's your new favorite. You make a note to share it with the evening shift scribe, who collects strange quotes for the Library of Misguided Wisdom, a secret compilation of the most bizarre, confusing, or plain unhinged sentences ever found in the archives. It's hidden in the spine of a false scroll labeled Annual Census Reports, Volume 20, which no one has opened in decades. You carefully transcribe, "One who binds the foot binds the soul. Therefore, let us walk barefoot into chaos." Perfect. The day ends as a dusty twilight filters through the upper windows, coating everything in amber. You descend the stairs and help reshelve a few neglected texts before heading to the librarian's quarters. There, the cook is experimenting again. Tonight's meal is a questionable stew involving lentils, wine-soaked leeks, and a dash of what she swears is powdered fish bladder. You chew politely while plotting which dried fig to bribe her with so she never makes it again. After dinner, you sit in the courtyard with Lucius and a junior scribe named Dharma. Together, you swap stories of failed love poems, misplaced curses, and the time a diplomat used a library scroll to swat a bee and accidentally started a minor feud. The night is warm, the moon soft, and the air smells faintly of dust and lavender. Tomorrow will bring new chaos, maybe a scroll-eating beetle outbreak, or a scholar trying to debate a statue. But for now, all is quiet. You lean back, close your eyes, and think once again that being a Roman librarian may not be the most heroic life, but it's full of stories, and sometimes that's better. You wake to a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you've somehow slipped into a different timeline, one where libraries no longer exist and scrolls have grown wings and flown off to better, less dusty destinies. But no, it's just early, and the usual morning procession of sandal-footed scribes hasn't arrived yet. You take advantage of the silence to wander through the archive alone, the way one might stroll through a sacred grove. The papyrus shelves stretch like dry-boned forests in every direction, and you let your fingers trace the wooden spines of scroll cases as you pass, reading their ancient labels, herbal remedies for menstrual madness, comets and the price of fish, civic laws regarding goats in baths. You pause at that last one. It's well thumbed, probably more relevant than anyone wants to admit. Your plan today is simple, at least in theory. You're tasked with sorting and transcribing a recently unearthed batch of provincial scrolls. From a town so minor, even its name sounds made up. Borbia, or maybe it's Borbius, no one agrees. The box that arrived last week is still unopened, gathering a quiet halo of guilt in the corner of the scriptorium. You haul it to your desk with the gentle determination of a man lifting a philosophical burden and pry it open. Immediately, you're hit with a smell that can only be described as old onions and existential regret. Inside, the scrolls are bundled tightly in worn cloth, tied with strings that crumble at your touch. The top one is a catalogue of local disputes, fence encroachments, bakery slander, a bizarre case involving a cursed sausage cart. You're not even surprised anymore. One entry stands out: a legal complaint about a man whose parrot had been taught to recite local gossip, leading to at least 3 broken engagements and 1 duel. You laugh, but gently, because deep down, you know you're going to have to sort, summarize, and potentially cross-reference that parrot with Roman defamation laws. Historians still argue whether such complaints were exaggerated or just reflect the daily absurdities of Roman life outside the major cities. As the library fills with people and light, you begin copying the first scroll, pausing every now and then to squint at a particularly blurry symbol that might be a stylized olive or just a very sleepy R. Midway through, you're interrupted by Portia, a senior scribe with a hairstyle so large it requires its own calendar. She's holding a broken stylus like it personally betrayed her. "Do you have the good ink?" she demands, and you know exactly what she means. The dark, rich stuff made with crushed walnut soot and a dash of mystery powder the cook swears is just leftover temple incense. You nod and produce the tiny jar you've hidden in your drawer, wrapped in layers of cloth and petty secrecy. Portia takes it with a grunt of gratitude, leaving behind a puff of perfume that smells faintly of crushed dreams and boiled figs. By lunchtime, you've made it through 2 scrolls and 3 minor identity crises. The content is so absurdly mundane. Land tax arguments, one very passionate but poorly written ode to a cow, and a detailed chart tracking the moods of a local. Well, that you start to question whether Borbia was real or just a tax scam invented by someone in need of a vacation. To clear your head, you head to the rooftop terrace, a hidden spot known only to librarians, night guards, and one suspicious cat named Jupiter Maximus. The view is modest, just the tiled roofs of the city stretching into the blur of the distance. But there's something peaceful about it. You chew a slightly overripe pear and wonder whether the cow from the ode was actually real or just poetic license. The scent of charcoal wafts up from a nearby bakery, and for a moment, you're tempted to abandon everything and become a professional bread taster. But no, the scrolls await, and someone has to make sense of Borbia's tragic vegetable, census. Back downstairs, you spend the afternoon translating a poorly spelled economic treatise that keeps referring to gold as cold, making every sentence sound like a winter warning. You scribble notes, reorganize a few names into the correct family trees, and add a footnote about a man who claimed to have married a river. Whether metaphorical or literal, no one ever clarified. The scroll ends abruptly, with the last words smudged by what you hope is wine, but suspect is regret. Just as you're thinking about packing up, Lucius rushes in, wild-eyed and holding what he claims is a miracle of linguistic horror. It's a scroll that appears to be written entirely in palindromes. "Is it a code?" he asks, panting. "Or is someone just showing off?" You read the first few lines. They make less and less sense the more you stare at them. "Eros, sore. I was sore," begins one section. Another says, "No lemon, no melon." And you begin to suspect someone had too much free time and access to ink. You add it to the section known as the linguistic zoo, a collection of texts that defy structure, reason, and sometimes even the alphabet. It includes a poem written entirely in drawings of various body parts and a shopping list accidentally copied over the lyrics to a funeral chant. Historians still debate whether these were mistakes or avant-garde genius ahead of their time. Either way, you treasure them like odd little scroll goblins, guarding their nonsense with academic pride. Evening comes quickly. The shadows grow long between the marble columns, and the last visitors drift out like leaves on a breeze. You linger behind to reshelve the new Borbia scrolls, creating an entirely new subcategory called extremely regional madness. It fits. You hide the parrot complaint in a scroll case marked zoning regulations and quietly add a tag: do not open unless emotionally prepared. As the doors close for the night, you find a note tucked into your drawer. Anonymous, of course. It simply reads, "You make the silence bearable." You smile, tuck it away, and head to bed, knowing tomorrow will bring more scrolls, more mysteries, and probably another unexpected parrot. The next morning starts not with the usual scribble of quills or the shuffling of sandals against stone, but with a low, echoing groan, something between a lion clearing its throat and a bureaucrat realizing he's lost a form. It's coming from the hallway, near the north storage vaults, a place you generally avoid because of its reputation for harboring scrolls so cursedly dull they've been known to put readers into brief, blissful comas. Naturally, you investigate, because what else are you going to do? File more reports on regional goat taxes. As you approach, the groaning intensifies, then abruptly stops, replaced by a loud sneeze. It's Marcus the apprentice, hunched over a half-rolled scroll and looking like he's been wrestling cobwebs all morning. He claims he found a sealed container behind one of the old racks, marked with a faded insignia that resembles either a winged book or a very smug duck. Inside, scrolls, lots of them, unlabeled, unsorted, and apparently written in some kind of shorthand that no one recognizes. You take one look and sigh, deeply, from the soul. This is going to be your day now. Back at your desk, you examine the first scroll under sunlight. The script resembles regular Latin, if it had been written by someone dictating during a chariot race. Some words are missing vowels, others are squashed together into tongue-breaking monstrosities. You mutter them aloud, half expecting a genie or mild stroke. Historians still argue whether this shorthand was a proto-speed writing system used by overworked clerks or just the result of someone getting bored and inventing a code to prank future readers. Either way, it's yours now. Your breakfast, a sad-looking barley cake, and a piece of cheese hard enough to be weaponized, sits untouched as you transcribe, decode, and occasionally curse. The scrolls, it turns out, are lecture notes. From a traveling philosopher who apparently specialized in existential complaints and overly metaphorical vegetable analogies. One section reads, "The soul is like a gourd, empty until filled, but prone to rot if left alone." Another claims, "Man is a fish, flopping between nets of duty and the frying pan of time." You write it all down, every last gourd and philosophical fish. Because somewhere out there, someone might need this. A visiting senator drops by to inspect the library's public-facing collection, and you're briefly pulled into polite conversation. He asks whether the library holds anything scandalous. You smile and direct him toward the scroll about the parrot and the sausage cart. "Mild scandal," you say. "Perfect for post-dinner reading." He's delighted. You briefly consider asking for a raise, then remember that your last raise was a slightly larger bowl of lentils and a new sponge. After the senator leaves, you meet with Domitia, one of the head archivists, to discuss where to categorize these strange shorthand scrolls. You propose a new classification. Experimental oratory, she suggests. Verbal mush. You compromise. With ambiguous rhetoric. You're both satisfied. For lunch, you step out to the market square, where the vendors yell with a kind of musical despair. You buy a handful of olives and watch two children argue over a stick, which has apparently been declared both a sword and a fishing rod, depending on who's yelling. It reminds you of Senate debates. Back at the library, you catch Lucius sneaking. A nap behind the stacks, his head resting on a copy of Eel Taxation and You. You throw a fig at him. He doesn't move. You let him sleep. By mid-afternoon, your shorthand philosopher scrolls start to form a kind of pattern, a diary of sorts. Not just lectures, but reflections. There's an entry about being laughed out. of a symposium for suggesting that emotions could be measured in units, like weight or temperature. Another mentions a rival philosopher who allegedly wore only blue and claimed to commune with bees. You jot down a footnote. Possible hallucination or cult. You get lost in the scrolls for hours, slowly translating each piece, untangling, metaphor after metaphor. One section ends with a phrase that makes you pause. To be remembered is to be stolen from death, one whisper at a time. You copy it carefully, underlining it in red. Evening comes, and with it, the librarian's ritual closing duties. You blow out the oil lamps one by one, the smell of smoke mingling with dust and ink. You lock the archive room, pat the stone, lion statue by the door for luck, everyone does, even the skeptical, and return to your desk for one last check. There's a new scroll waiting for you. No name, no label, just resting there, as if it appeared by magic or very passive-aggressive delivery. You open it and read the first line. For the one who watches, who listens, who guards forgotten voices. The rest is a story, a simple fable written in elegant hand about a librarian who saved a kingdom not with swords or armies, but by remembering which scroll had the right treaty. It ends with the line, "He knew where it was, and that was enough." You don't recognize the handwriting, but you smile. Maybe it's a gift. Maybe it's a test. Maybe it's someone else out there who understands that the library isn't just a building full of dead thoughts. It's a breathing, whispering thing. And you're its pulse. As you leave for the night, you take one last look at the darkened shelves, each scroll resting like a cocoon of story and secret, waiting for hands like yours. Outside, the moon has risen, pale and wide, casting the forum in silver. You walk home slowly, your bag heavy with olives, ink stains on your fingers, and the quiet joy of having spent the day among mad philosophers, mystery scrolls, and the peculiar poetry of Roman bureaucracy. The morning air is unusually still as you arrive at the library, not quite ominous, but suspiciously quiet, like Rome has collectively decided to hold its breath until something embarrassing happens. The birds aren't chirping. The baker didn't shout at his son. Even the old man who usually sits on the corner mumbling about chariot regulations is nowhere to be seen. You squint up at the sky, half expecting to see a divine memo scrawled across the clouds. Rebooting Empire. Please. Wait. Inside, things aren't much livelier. A stack of new scrolls has arrived, courtesy of a minor provincial governor who fancies himself a poet. That's never a good sign. You crack the seal on the first one and read aloud, "O chaste and golden duck, whose bill doth pierce the pond of fate." You stop. You blink. You place the scroll gently in the deep storage pile, right between military supply inventory 63 BCE and philosophical debates on turnip farming. Meanwhile, Marcus, your overly enthusiastic apprentice, has discovered the wonders of cataloging metadata and is now running around gleefully attaching color-coded wax seals to everything, including your lunch. You try to explain that olives don't need classification, but he insists that red wax means mildly philosophical. He's not entirely wrong. You leave him to it, remembering that the best way to train an archivist is to let them over-organize until they collapse in existential exhaustion. Your task today, however, is more delicate. A visiting scholar from Alexandria, yes, that Alexandria, has requested a full review of Rome's holdings on early natural philosophy. She's polite, well-read, and terrifying in that serene, I can quote Aristotle while insulting your dress sense sort of way. You want to impress her, which is hard, given that your best scrolls on natural philosophy mostly involve people arguing, whether clouds are made of sheep farts or evaporated river gods. Still, you do your best. You lay out selections from Lucretius, some diagrams from a Greek engineer who may or may not have invented the world's first potato launcher, and a mysterious fragment describing the properties of something called liquid fire that smells faintly of pine tar and regrets. The Alexandrian scholar reviews the materials with a frown so subtle it could be a muscle spasm. She finally selects the least ridiculous scroll and nods. "Acceptable," she says. You beam with pride. Later, Lucius wanders in holding a damaged scroll like it's a half-eaten sandwich. "This one had a mouse in it," he announces. You blink. "In it?" "Yes. Living." You take the scroll and carefully unroll it. It appears to be a short treatise on the acoustics of temple bells, now generously chewed along the margins. You sigh, call for a scribe to copy the legible parts, and gently relocate the rodent, who seems unimpressed by the interruption. Historians still argue whether Roman libraries had official pest control or simply tolerated mice as part of the literary ecosystem. Either way, you begin drafting a tongue-in-cheek field guide, identifying rodents by scroll preference. It's surprisingly detailed. That afternoon, a minor noble arrives to donate a rare and valuable volume to the library. You brace yourself. It's always something rare and valuable, which usually means stolen and incomprehensible. This one is wrapped in velvet, sealed with 3 different wax sigils, and smells faintly of lavender and paranoia. Inside, a scroll, written in a bizarre cipher composed entirely of illustrations of cows. You stare at it. The noble beams. "It's from the northern frontiers," he says proudly. "A sacred text. We think it might contain divine recipes." You manage to thank him politely while mentally assigning the scroll to the future mystery department. As he leaves, you overhear him whispering to his companion, "I'm certain the cows mean something. Look at the udders. They're definitely symbolic." Later, you show the scroll to Demisha. She snorts. "Symbolic. Of what? Lactose anxiety?" You both laugh, which echoes around the stacks in a way that makes even the busts of old senators seem slightly amused. You're still chuckling when Marcus barrels in, out of breath and waving a piece of parchment. "Emergency!" he yells. "The papyrus shipment from Ostia is delayed." You pause. "That's not an emergency. But we're down to the last 2 sheets of the good stuff," he whines. "And Lucius spilled ink on one." You glance at Lucius, who shrugs and holds up inky fingers. "It attacked me first," he mutters. So, for the rest of the day, you implement what you call papyrus rationing protocols, limiting scribes to essential copying only and repurposing the backs of older training scrolls. Marcus sulks. Lucius tries to draw a caricature of Demisha, using only leftover ink and sarcasm. You wonder if the Great Library of Alexandria had this many small disasters per hour. Probably. Great institutions are just glorified chaos factories with better branding. As twilight descends, you find yourself alone in the back reading room, thumbing through a scroll you copied years ago, a commentary on lunar eclipses by a philosopher who believed the moon was a celestial eye, occasionally blinking. There's a calm in his madness, a logic that borders on lyrical nonsense. You sip your last cup of lukewarm herb tea and murmur his words aloud. The cosmos is not watched by gods, but by itself, dreaming and waking in turns. You close your eyes for a moment, wondering if the stars ever notice when someone down here remembers their names. Then the quiet is broken by Marcus shouting from the archives, "I found a map drawn entirely in poetry." You groan. Another long night ahead. But secretly, you smile, because somehow this is exactly what you signed up for. Ancient nonsense, infinite mystery, and the ridiculous hope that maybe, just maybe, one of these scrolls will whisper something real before the ink fades forever. You're halfway through sorting an obnoxiously large bundle of anonymous poetry scrolls, most of which appear to be either love songs to cucumbers or dramatic retellings of pigeon sightings, when a surprisingly clean and crisply rolled scroll catches your eye. The wax seal bears an unfamiliar insignia, 2 crossed flutes above a lyre, which somehow already feels like a warning. Curious, you unroll it, expecting yet another third-rate imitation of Virgil. Instead, you find a meticulously detailed guide on how to stage a dramatic performance in the style of the old Etruscans, complete with stage diagrams, actor instructions, and baffling musical annotations written entirely in bird calls. You stare. at it, brow furrowed, trying to decipher what a double thrush trill is supposed to sound like. Marcus appears over your shoulder with the perfect amount of inopportune timing and immediately suggests staging a performance. You laugh. Then you realize he's serious. Before you can say anything, he's already gathered Lucius, Domitia, and 2 confused junior scribes into what he's calling a theatrical research symposium. You rub your temples. What have you unleashed? An hour later, your private reading alcove has become a makeshift amphitheater. Lucius insists on playing all 4 main roles because, as he puts it, only I can capture the complex emotional nuance of a mourning Etruscan ghost king. Domitia, reluctantly cast as the ancient village crone, improvises most of her lines and throws in a few Roman legal terms for flavour. Marcus provides musical accompaniment by clacking together 2 wax tablets and whistling ominously. The result is something. Not quite a tragedy, not exactly a comedy, but definitely a fire hazard. You're about to call it off when a senior librarian enters, drawn by the noise. She watches the performance in absolute silence. Then, without a word, she nods slowly and walks away. Marcus is overjoyed. She loved it, he says. Historians still argue whether Etruscan theatre involved interpretive bird noises, you reply, deadpan. But this will certainly settle nothing. By the end of the day, half the staff has volunteered to perform in next week's historically speculative, dramatic experiment. You, of course, are now the director. Somehow. You try to shift your focus back to actual library work, but news of the performance has begun to ripple beyond the walls. A passing senator's aide stops by to ask whether the Ghost King will be wearing a tunic or a toga. A local baker offers to donate olive cakes for the intermission. Even the city's official augur sends a note asking if he can do a reading of the omens beforehand. You sigh, realizing your once serene world of scrolls and silent study has now officially entered its experimental theatre era. At least it's more interesting than sorting cucumber odes. While trying to return to some kind of normalcy, you resume cataloguing a donation from a merchant who claims to have acquired authentic Atlantean writings. You don't have the heart to tell him that Atlantis was mostly a philosophical metaphor, and that the scrolls he's donated are clearly just repurposed shipping manifests from Carthage, with the names scratched out and replaced with dramatic flourishes like Poseidon's tax report. Still, the parchment is decent, so you accept them with a grateful smile and mark the bundle as Speculative Myths, Tier 3. In the margins of one scroll, someone has doodled a surprisingly detailed seahorse wearing a helmet. You consider framing it. Later, you're asked to speak at a small gathering of scholars on the topic of the role of libraries in shaping imperial identity. You prepare a modest speech, mostly about scroll preservation and the careful balance of neutrality and responsibility in information curation. But the questions quickly spiral. Someone asks whether libraries should be used to preserve only Rome's greatness. Another suggests compiling an official list of patriotic scrolls. You feel a headache blooming. You calmly explain that libraries aren't propaganda machines. They're mirrors, not statues. Historians still argue whether Roman librarians were passive keepers of knowledge or quiet subversives who used their collections to shape public consciousness. You like to think it's both. That night, you dream you're chased through the library by a giant wax seal demanding proper citations. You wake up slightly terrified and moderately impressed. The next morning, the apprentice scribes surprise you with a small gift, a scroll of limericks about your daily habits, lovingly titled Ode to the Stern Librarian with the Kind Eyes. It includes gems like, he sorts every scroll with such grace, even ones smeared with anchovy paste. You roll your eyes and smile. You'd confiscate it, but the meter's surprisingly good. At lunch, you eat with Domitia on the front steps, watching a group of students argue about which philosopher would win in a chariot race. The consensus is that Socrates would get distracted, Seneca would crash out of principle, and Epicurus would never leave the tavern. You contribute, Plotinus would just teleport. This sparks a debate about whether Neoplatonism implies metaphysical shortcuts in public transportation. You sip your watered wine and wonder, not for the first time, how a quiet life in a Roman library became this strange whirlwind of scrolls, ghosts, and unsolicited seahorse fan art. And yet, as you glance back at the great doors of the library, solid oak, groaning on their hinges, sheltering a world of ancient nonsense and fragile genius, you feel oddly content. This is your domain, not the loud, conquering Rome of senators and soldiers, but the thoughtful, whispering Rome of ink and memory, a Rome that survives in brittle pages and the quiet minds that keep them alive. You take one last bite of fig, dust off your tunic, and head back inside. There's a mislabeled scroll from a Greek satirist you've been meaning to read. Something about philosophy, turnips, and dreams. Seems just right. You return to your desk to find a papyrus scroll delicately balanced atop your wax tablet, left there by someone with a strong sense of drama and absolutely no concern for your ever-expanding backlog. The scroll is bound in purple thread, a sign that it comes from the imperial household, and the seal is unmistakable. A stylized aquila, Rome's sacred eagle, wings spread over the letters SPQR. Your heart sinks just a little. Imperial scrolls rarely contain fan mail. With a resigned exhale, you break the seal and unroll it slowly. The writing is crisp, the hand educated, and the message surprisingly polite. You've been summoned, it says, to assist with the organization and restoration of a long-neglected collection stored beneath the Palatine Hill. The collection was once private property of a former empress, now deceased, and rumor suggests it contains both banned works and lost manuscripts. The note closes with a flourish and a gentle threat disguised as a compliment. We trust your wisdom and discretion, librarian. You barely suppress a groan. When the Empire asks for discretion, it usually means prepare to find something dangerous. Still, curiosity gnaws at you. Within days, you're escorted to the Palatine Undercroft by 2 guards who clearly don't trust you not to steal anything, despite the fact that your hands are full of parchment, brushes, and a preservation kit. The space is vast, cooler than the surface, and reeks faintly of damp stone and old wax. Torches cast flickering shadows across stacked urns, crumbling shelves, and velvet-draped niches that haven't seen sunlight in decades. The air hums with the faint pressure of secrets. You set to work. At first, most of the scrolls are mundane. Correspondence, family records, recipes involving exotic birds, and too much saffron. But then, tucked behind a row of marble busts, you find something stranger. A slim codex bound in leather, a format still considered experimental by many Roman scholars. Inside are fragments of philosophical musings, dream interpretations, and what appears to be a fictional dialogue between an enslaved cook and the ghost of Cicero, arguing over the ethics of over-seasoning. You read it twice, then wrap it carefully, and place it in your urgent but confusing pile. You can't help but feel that this place, neglected as it is, might house the kind of intellectual residue the Empire would rather forget. Historians still argue whether elite Roman women maintained underground libraries to preserve controversial thought. You whisper to yourself, eyeing the Empress's initials etched discreetly into a wooden chest. You open it. Inside, poetry. Love poetry. Scandalous love poetry. Possibly autobiographical. You shut the chest gently, your face a model of practiced neutrality. A few days into the project, you're joined by a young scribe from Alexandria, assigned to assist you in deciphering damaged Greek passages. His name is Aelius, and he's refreshingly competent. Together, you uncover a pattern. Many of the manuscripts hidden here deal with resistance, not open rebellion, but the quieter, slipperier kind. Philosophical essays on freedom of the mind, parables about choice, fate, and tricksters outwitting tyrants. You realize you're cataloguing an intellectual rebellion tucked beneath the marble feet of emperors. One scroll, half molded and brittle, as dried seaweed, describes an imagined debate between Plato and a Roman gladiator. The gladiator wins the argument. The next day, you find a series of encoded poems. It takes both you and Aelius to break the cipher, and when you do, the the content turns your stomach. A first-hand account of a political purge, written in veiled metaphor, comparing senators to birds caught in a net. The writing is sharp, precise, furious. You copy the contents, then burn the original, an act that feels like both sacrilege and salvation. That night, you lie awake in your tiny sleeping quarters, counting ceiling cracks and wondering how many lives were saved or ruined by the scrolls you now hold. Rome worships permanence, stone arches, bronze statues, marble forums. But you're beginning to think the real strength of Rome is in its ability to forget at just the right time. Back in the library, you resume your regular duties. The others notice you seem a bit quieter, your gaze lingering a little longer on certain scrolls. Domitia jokes that you've seen the ghosts of scribes past. You smile, but don't elaborate. Instead, you throw yourself into the task of reconstructing the library's index, a maddening, month-long project involving lost entries, missing shelf tags, and one prank involving a squirrel and a forged librarian signature. One evening, while sorting damaged scrolls by scent, yes, scent, because water damage and mold each have distinct aromas, you discover a heavily ink-stained scroll that refuses to unroll. After hours of delicate work with steam and patience, it finally reveals itself to be an early satire by an unknown author writing under the pseudonym Scribulus the Mildly Peeved. It's absurd, scathing, and oddly modern in its critique of Roman bureaucracy. You laugh out loud at one line, and thus did the noble clerk declare a holiday, having misplaced the forms that might have said otherwise. You decide to preserve it personally. A month passes. The Palatine project concludes. Your findings are quietly shelved, and the Empire returns to pretending those texts never existed. But you know better. You know what Rome buries, and what she fears. You glance across the library floor as Marcus and Lucius bicker about the best way to categorize philosophical dialogues that end in fistfights. The lights are low. A new scroll arrives, tied in green thread, rumored to be a first-hand account of Nero's infamous poetry recital. You sigh, stretch your fingers, and prepare for another round of sorting, reading, preserving. You live in the margins of empire. Friend, not in the bright marble courts or the blood-stained arenas, but in the quiet, flickering shadows of ink and thought. And Rome, whether she knows it or not, lives in you too. You're roused early by the raspy clink of amphorae outside your quarters, some overzealous porter trying to deliver oil for the baths before sunrise. You groan into your wool blanket, half tempted to pretend you're dead, so you won't be. Asked to verify the shipment. But alas, you're a Roman librarian, not exactly allowed the luxury of mystery disappearances. You drag yourself out of bed and shuffle to the door, only to find not olive oil, but crates of scrolls stacked like drunken columns, each marked with a red wax seal shaped like a miniature lyre. Music manuscripts, lots of them. Someone somewhere, probably, with a bad sense of humour, has decided the Central Library should now also house the capital's musical archives. You stare at the delivery note and read the instructions aloud, in a voice dripping with disbelief. To be sorted by genre, mood, and thematic resonance. You squint up at the sky, trying to determine if this is some cosmic joke. Apparently, the Senate has decreed that musical knowledge is essential to cultural identity, which sounds noble until you realize you now have to catalogue thousands of anonymous dirges, celebratory odes, and flute solos with titles like Ode to a Goose in Autumn and The Spleenful Lament of Publius the Flatulent. And of course, nobody has provided a classification system. That's your job. After all, you're the custodian of mental harmony, or whatever nonsense phrase they slapped on your last certificate. You begin with the most obvious sorting technique, by instrument. Soon your desk is littered with miniature sketches of lyres, panpipes, hydraulis organs, and a few oddly shaped things that you suspect might be vegetable slicers rather than instruments. The scribe assigned to assist you this week, a cheerful but musically tone-deaf fellow named Junius, insists on testing every instrument sketch by mimicking its sound. You last about an hour before banishing him to the storage annex with the particularly aggressive scrollworms. As you sift through verses praising Neptune's waves, set to jaunty triplets, you begin to realize something unexpected. These musical texts aren't just entertainment, they're repositories of memory. Many are written in layers like palimpsests of sound. One scroll might open with a hymn to Jupiter, but hide a mourning song for a lost child in its rhythm pattern. Others include notations for communal dances, festival rituals, or even comedic, pantomime directions. Turns out ancient Romans loved interpretive dance more than you'd expect. There's one composition that especially haunts you. A slow, melodic piece dedicated to the ghosts of gladiators. The notation is sparse, the lyrics minimal. Just 4 lines. Beneath the sand, they rest. Blood dries where cheers once rang. Shadows linger where eyes once burned. Sing not for the dead, but for memory. You stare at it for a long time, wondering if it was ever truly performed, or if it was just one musician's attempt to say the unsayable. Historians still argue whether music in ancient Rome was ever allowed to critique the state, you murmur, as you carefully wrap the scroll in waxed linen. Late in the week, a senator's aide appears, announcing that a noblewoman has offered her personal collection of musical ephemera for donation, on the strict condition that it be curated in a separate, elevated space. She doesn't want her poetry scrolls mixed in with the common fare, the aide says, nose wrinkled as if he's just smelled a plebeian. You agree to the donation, but not without drafting a quiet side note into the archive register. Shelf B4, Snob Songs. When the collection arrives, you find it contains not just scrolls, but small bronze discs with etched grooves, an early form of musical coding, now obsolete. No one remembers how to play them. You document each one, carefully describing the etching patterns and theorizing about playback methods. Maybe some future librarian will rediscover the technique. For now, they sit silently in their velvet-lined cases, the music of their age lost to time, but not entirely forgotten. You've grown fond of the rhythmic scratches and occasional margin, notes composers left. Too fast? Add more triumph here. Cut second verse if crowd seems bored. It's a window into their creative process, flawed and messy and very human. You even find one scroll with a wine stain and a love note scribbled at the end. To Julia, may your voice outlast empires. You smile at that. After 2 weeks, the music section is finally organized. Not perfectly, but well enough that a visitor wouldn't trip over a panpipe concerto while searching for Cicero. You breathe easier knowing that, tucked among the histories and philosophical treatises, there now lives a collection of emotion made audible. And just when you're starting to enjoy the soft, dusty rhythm of your days again, Domitia slaps a new scroll on your desk and says, "We need to talk about the erotic poetry situation." You blink. "There's a situation." "A major one," she nods. Apparently, a crate meant for the Temple of Venus was accidentally filed under agricultural practices. You sigh. Of course it was. You can only imagine some poor scholar trying to study irrigation techniques and stumbling across verses like, "Your lips like ripe figs, your gaze like Dionysus, drunk on longing. Time to roll up your sleeves." Again. You're knee-deep in scrolls and scandal before breakfast, thanks to that accidental misplacement of erotic poetry among farming manuals. And now, thanks to the Senate's firm stance on public decency, or at least its tendency to panic, at the whiff of a bare ankle in literature, you're tasked with the delicate mission of combing through every misfiled scroll to determine what is respectable romance, and what falls into the category of dangerously arousing metaphors. So, you sit with a steaming cup of barley tea and prepare to skim what feels like every smouldering sonnet written between the reigns of Augustus and Hadrian. The first one you read begins innocently enough, describing a harvest of beauty and golden stalks rising at dawn, until you realize those aren't actually agricultural metaphors. You groan. The second opens with, "Her gaze plowed through my soul." Nope, still not about grain. Somewhere around scroll 30, you begin to admire the sheer creativity of ancient Rome's more amorous poets. They could turn anything into innuendo: wind, olives, architecture, even legal contracts. One verse earnestly compares the feeling of desire to the process of filing property tax documents, which is either genius or a cry for help. The library's official stance, of course, is that all such material must be catalogued carefully, but placed on restricted access shelves, only viewable by scholars with specific clearance, or, let's be honest, bored aristocrats with fake moustaches and bad excuses. To keep things orderly, you draft a new classification scheme: R1 for romantic, R2 for risque, and R3 for really should be read in private. You even affix tiny grape stickers to the most decadent ones, as a private joke between you and Domitia, who now insists on doing all the R3 reviews herself for quality assurance. The deeper you dive into the archives, the more you realize just how much Roman poetry wasn't about titillation, but connection. Even the most florid verses often hid real longing, heartbreak, or satirical digs at lovers who ghosted their partners by claiming they'd been conscripted into the army. Historians still argue whether Roman erotic poetry reflected genuine emotion or simply served as clever literary games. You whisper as you copy a particularly tender stanza onto fresh parchment for preservation. You find one scroll written in the shaky hand of an elderly poet, addressed to a long-dead wife. It reads, "Though your skin turn to dust, your voice sings in the folds of my thoughts." You pause longer than expected on that line. Moments like these make you think that being a librarian isn't just about books. It's about safeguarding human messiness in all its sticky, cringy, earnest beauty. One day, while returning a cluster of R2 scrolls to their leather bindings, you stumble across something even more surprising: a scroll hidden inside a false-bottomed crate marked Municipal Tax Records, 84 CE. You unroll it slowly. It's handwritten in charcoal ink, unsigned, unnumbered, and smells faintly of myrrh and almonds. The language is informal, almost confessional, and the poem reads like a diary entry. It details a clandestine relationship between a senator and a gladiator, complete with secret moonlit meetings near the Forum Boreum and coded exchanges during public games. There's no name, no attribution, but the voice is vivid and raw, as if the author had written it not for fame, but simply to get the feeling out. You show it to Domitia, who reads it silently, then places it gently in a velvet pouch without a word. "Let's just say, this one goes in the special preservation vault," she says, and you don't ask any more questions. Over the following weeks, you organize a quiet exhibit titled The Hidden Heart of Rome. It's not advertised, not announced. You simply leave the doors ajar and allow curious scholars, scribes, and janitors to wander in. Inside, you display fragments of verses, uncensored and unashamed. Some are silly. There's an ode to a woman's elbows written in hexameter. Others are somber, like the one signed by Justinus, who wept alone at the fountain. You even place a wax tablet that contains a carved message. She said goodbye with her sandals still warm. Every evening, you tidy the room and whisper to the scrolls as you close the door, like they're old friends who just needed someone to listen. Your reward for this literary compassion: a summons from a very displeased magistrate who received an anonymous tip that indecent materials were being displayed within sniffing distance of the children's mythology shelf. You sigh and prepare your defense. At the hearing, you begin with a bold statement. "Senators, if your idea of virtue excludes love, then your library will be sterile and unloved." There's a long silence. Someone sneezes in the back. Eventually, they decide to issue you a formal reprimand and a wax plaque for creative curation under pressure. You hang it proudly behind your desk. After the incident, visitors trickle more cautiously into the poetry annex, but you know they're coming. You see the footprints in the dust, the subtle adjustments to scrolls you know were opened, and occasionally, the smallest thank you notes folded into the creases. Your work continues, not just preserving words, but the fragile truths buried inside them. And just when you think things might calm down, Domitia tosses a wax-sealed bundle onto your desk, labelled Dream Logs of Emperor Hadrian. She raises, an eyebrow. Apparently, he had some thoughts about architecture and horses. You close your eyes. Of course he did. Time to find out what kind of bedtime stories emperors told themselves before conquering the world. You don't expect Emperor Hadrian's dream logs to be anything more than mildly eccentric bedtime ramblings. Perhaps a fondness for marble, or an occasional flying aqueduct. But as you slice open the wax seal with the edge of your stylus, you realize this is going to be one of those scrolls. The kind that starts as mild curiosity and ends with you buried in commentaries by sunrise. The scroll is surprisingly well preserved, scribed in Hadrian's distinctive, borderline theatrical hand, full of exaggerated loops and emphatic underlines, like a drama teacher writing grocery lists. The opening line reads, "I dreamed of a city that breathed." You pause. That's either the start of a masterpiece or a breakdown. The next passages unfurl in fragmented images, columns rising like trees, rivers under floors, a bed of moss in the Senate. You blink. Hadrian apparently had dreams where infrastructure was cuddly and political institutions had carpeting. It gets weirder. Antinous appeared, he writes, but his voice was made of bronze, and he spoke only in riddles. You look around the archive as if anyone might be watching, then keep reading. Antinous, the emperor's famously beloved companion, shows up in nearly every dream, usually bringing oddly specific advice like, paint the library's northern wall with moonlight, or do not trust the goat by the vineyard gate. Historians still argue whether these records reflect genuine dream sequences, mystical rituals, or some proto-psychological exercise Hadrian used to justify his more eccentric architectural commissions. You personally think it's a combination of ambition, affection, and too much spiced wine. Over the next few days, you and Domitia begin cataloguing the scrolls together. She reads aloud while you transcribe, the two of you slowly building a picture of Hadrian's subconscious, one where art, grief, love, and engineering blur together into strange, symbolic tableau. There's one dream in which Hadrian walks into a temple built entirely of mirrors, searching for the reflection of someone who no longer exists. Another where he speaks to a lion with Antinous' eyes, who guards a door labelled Lethe. Domitia pauses at that one. That's the river of forgetfulness, right? You nod. You don't need a scholarly debate to feel the weight of what's implied. What starts as a translation task becomes a nightly ritual. After hours, with oil lamps burning low and the city quiet, you meet in the far annex and read another dream. One evening, the scroll describes Hadrian arguing with a talking aqueduct about whether time flows backward. Sounds about right, Domitia murmurs. I argued with a scroll cabinet this morning about whether it could hold one more volume. You grin. The strangeness starts to infect your own dreams. One night, you see yourself walking through a library where all the scrolls are birds, fluttering from shelf to shelf, whispering lines of poetry in your ears. Another night, you see Hadrian's Temple of Mirrors, except this time, you're the reflection searching for someone else. You wake with ink stains on your fingers and an odd sense of homesickness. For what, you're not quite sure. One dream. Log describes a staircase that descends beneath the Tiber, where memories sit in jars and the floor smells like lavender. Another ends with the line, I kissed the sky and tasted salt. You and Domitia begin collecting your favourites in a private ledger, which you half-jokingly title Hadrian's Pillow Thoughts. It's your little secret, a strange soft corner in the rigid world of Roman record-keeping. One day, while digging through a batch of scrolls misfiled under municipal plumbing projects, you discover a bundle of dream notes written not by Hadrian, but to him. Signed only with the letter A, they describe dreams about the emperor. You stood above me on a marble bridge, holding a torch shaped like an owl. I followed your footsteps into a garden of sound. They're poetic, reverent, and quietly devastating. You and Domitia read them in silence. There's no doubt in your minds. These are Antinous' dreams, or at least someone writing in his voice. Scholars might dismiss them as forgeries, literary exercises, or fan fiction from the 2nd century. But as you sit there, under the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, the words feel too raw to be invented. The day you chose me, the moon stayed longer, one line reads. The day you lost me, it fled before noon. Your throat tightens. Domitia closes the scroll without a word. For weeks afterward, you find yourself thinking about love that doesn't get neatly recorded in marble inscriptions or golden statues, the kind that lives in the back shelves of a library, hidden under plumbing reports. The kind that breathes in metaphors, sleeps in dreams, and quietly survives 2,000 years of dust. You decide to file Hadrian's dream logs not under imperial correspondence, but under a new category, architectures of the mind. You sketch a special glyph for it, a stylized eye wrapped in laurel, and carve it onto the storage crate. Domitia approves. Fitting, she says. His buildings lasted, but this is what makes them alive. One afternoon, a scholar visiting from Alexandria asks to see Hadrian's official decrees on city planning. You hand over the relevant scrolls, but tuck the dream logs back in the vault. They weren't meant for policies or public readings. They were meant for quiet corners, soft candlelight, and people who understood that sometimes the truest map of an emperor isn't carved in stone, but scribbled in the dark, where no one was supposed to look. By now, your fingertips know the exact texture of every kind of papyrus stored in this building, the smooth glide of newly copied scrolls, the crinkled edges of flood-damaged rolls, and the almost silky texture of imperial vellum meant for decrees and correspondence of the highest order. So when a crate arrives from the eastern provinces, its outer wrapping marked with the purple seal of Syria and dusted with the unmistakable scent of frankincense and sun-baked parchment, you know it's going to be an unusual day. The contents inside don't disappoint. You unroll the first scroll to find a letter addressed to a Roman official from a librarian in Palmyra, describing their collection of astronomical treatises and a request to exchange records with the Central Archive in Rome. That, in itself, is fascinating. But what really catches your eye is the attached commentary, written in a neat, upright hand, in which the Palmyrene librarian argues that the moon has influence not only over the tides, but over human memory itself. A full moon quickens the mind, it claims, but the new moon buries names in the dust. It's obviously pseudo-scientific, yet you find yourself wondering how many sleepless Roman nights have been filled with half-lost memories that return only under moonlight. Historians still argue whether lunar theories of memory were fringe beliefs or part of a broader tradition among Eastern scholars. But what's clear is that the librarian who wrote this was daring enough to challenge Roman orthodoxy and eloquent enough to be heard. As you examine more scrolls from Palmyra, Petra, and Antioch, a pattern emerges. These Eastern libraries weren't just borrowing Roman knowledge, they were remixing it, challenging it, annotating it with footnotes in Aramaic, Greek, and Nabatean, even cross-referencing local oral traditions. One treatise compares Roman water clocks with Babylonian shadow dials, suggesting the latter could hear the sun's footsteps more clearly at noon. Another discusses Roman architectural acoustics, but adds a bizarre footnote. A voice, shouted in a dome, can awaken a sleeping god, used only for announcements or desperate apologies. You pause. Is that poetry, sarcasm, or a theological warning? Hard to say. Either way, you copy it into your personal notebook titled Unhinged Wisdom of the Empire. Domitia snorts when you show it to her. I'm starting to think librarians are all a little off, she says, poking your arm. Present company included. But there's pride in her voice when she says it. She's been cataloguing a series of scrolls from Alexandria, rich with diagrams and marginalia that dance between genius and chaos. One passage claims that if you hum a particular scale while lighting a lamp, the flame will flicker in the rhythm of your breathing. Another suggests that too much reading of tragedy scrolls without balancing comedy may cause melancholia of the spleen. Is that a metaphor? Or did some ancient Greek really believe you could diagnose sadness in the spleen? You're not sure, but it doesn't matter. Because the more you read, the more you realize that these libraries weren't passive archives. They were living dialogues, filled with arguments, jokes, dreams and warnings sent like messages in a bottle from one scholar to the next across time and geography. One scroll from a Phoenician scribe includes a recipe for ink made with crushed beetles and sea salt. The next scroll, written perhaps a century later by someone in Gaul, comments, "In the margins, tried it, smells like sadness, use sparingly." You laugh. It's like watching the empire's mind unfold, not in battles and borders, but in the margins of scrolls where humans disagreed, teased each other, and sometimes wrote just to be remembered. You begin curating a special section in the archive, labelled Correspondences Unusual. It includes these trans-provincial scrolls, full of half-believed theories, outrageous metaphors, and wild inventions. You create your own glyph for the category, a stylized ear surrounded by stars, to mark the theme of listening across space. And as you piece together these literary whispers from across the empire, you feel more than just pride. You feel connected, not just to Domitia or the other librarians, but to scribes in distant cities you'll never visit, who once sat by lamps just like yours, trying to make sense of the world in sentences that barely survived. One evening, Domitia finds a scroll, so old the ink is barely legible, but what you can make out is astonishing. A short poem, written by someone in Bactria, maybe a century ago. It goes, "If I die, bury me near a library, so my silence echoes with every turning scroll." You don't know who wrote it. The name has faded, but you write the verse again in your own journal, preserving it one more time. For some reason, it feels like the most important thing you've read all week. You and Domitia spend late nights imagining the personalities of these long-dead librarians. The romantic from Thebes, who wrote love letters on the back of census reports. The prankster from Hispania, who inserted puns into military records. The philosopher from Ephesus, who believed scrolls had dreams of their own and left pages blank so they could write themselves. Of course, none of this is provable. But who needs proof when you have poetry, when you have the scent of frankincense, and the feeling that someone out there, centuries ago, also forgot their lunch and cursed? At a filing cabinet, you leave a blank scroll in your personal chest, just in case you want to add your own marginalia one day. Maybe you'll write about the time you read a Syrian treatise on lunar memory and started remembering dreams from your childhood. Or maybe you'll write nothing at all and let the scroll sleep, waiting for the next curious soul to find it and wonder who left it there and why. You're so deep into your work now that the smell of old ink and the brittle sound of papyrus unrolling feels more familiar than your own reflection, which you only glimpse occasionally in the polished bronze basin by the archivist's door. Each morning begins with the same ritual. Soft footsteps echoing through the long marble corridors, the creak of the archive's heavy cedar door, and the faint gust of trapped ancient air that rushes past as you enter. A scent that always reminds you of history itself, something between dried fig leaves, wax, and the warm musk of knowledge stored too long. But today, something breaks the pattern. Domitia isn't at her usual spot, and in her place sits an elderly man whose robes are edged in gold thread and whose scroll case bears the mark of the Senate's own seal. You blink, momentarily wondering if you've misread the schedule or if some important inspection has caught you by surprise. But no, he's here for a very different reason. His name is Gaius Septimus Callistratus, a former military strategist turned philosopher, and he's brought with him an unusual request. He wants you to help him locate lost documents about the rituals of forgetting. At first, you think it's a metaphor, another poetic scholar seeking drama in the footnotes, but he's dead serious. Apparently, in certain periods of Roman history, there were actual ceremonies meant to erase people from collective memory. Not just damnatio memoriae that you've heard of, the official condemnation and erasure of names from records, statues, and family trees, but stranger, more obscure traditions. Processions through side streets at midnight, the burning of whisper scrolls, the smearing of ink over names while chanting Latin phrases in reverse. Historians still argue whether these were real state-sanctioned rituals or more of a religious fringe practice, but the Senate's private archive apparently holds partial mentions, and Callistratus wants to see if the public library still holds a matching account. So you search. You dig deep into the oldest corners of the archive, into the forgotten sections where mice have nested beside legal scrolls, and whole shelves lean precariously like exhausted soldiers. You find references here and there, a scribbled mention, in a scroll from Lucius Varro, who claimed he once saw such a ritual performed outside a bathhouse at midnight in Etruria. A fragment of a senator's diary noting that Gaius Livius was made unspoken today, whatever that means. One particularly strange scroll buried behind a stack of unused census data includes a chant written backwards. When you carefully transcribe it forward, it reads, "Let his name dry like ink in the sun. Let his deeds rot like scrolls in a flood." Creepy, and yet it makes a strange kind of bureaucratic sense. What is forgetting if not a state function? The empire's memory, after all, is just a series of scrolls, archives, temple records, and stone inscriptions. If you control those, you control what is remembered, and by extension, what is erased. Callistratus nods grimly when you share your findings. To forget, he says, is the most powerful punishment we've ever invented. Exile is lonely. Prison is harsh, but to be unwritten. That is death for the Roman soul. His voice echoes in the silent archive. Later that week, you and Domitia stumble upon an even more curious find. An anonymous satire scroll hidden behind a wall plaque, preserved under a layer of waxed linen. It's titled simply, "On the Minister of Memory," and it describes a fictional bureaucrat in the imperial court, whose job it is to keep a list of names that must never be spoken again. The scroll is hilarious, filled with dry jokes about how the minister always forgets his own lunch, loses track of who's been erased, and ends up accidentally deleting his own name from the records. But buried in the jokes is a darker truth. One line reads, "To forget is to command the past. To remember is to disobey." You copy that into your private notebook immediately. It keeps you awake that night. If forgetting can be organized, if memories can be suppressed with ceremonies and scroll edits, then what's the difference between history and fiction? Between truth and paperwork? You think of the old librarian who trained you, who once said, "Every empire rewrites itself eventually, usually by accident." You didn't understand that back then. You do now. Over the next several days, you and Domitia become obsessed with finding more clues. One entry in a satirical festival program lists a mock play titled "The Man Who Was Remembered Too Loudly." A comedy, supposedly, but no script survives. Another fragment, written in poor Latin on the back of a wine invoice, reads, "Burned 3 names today, smoke was blue, felt nothing." Is that metaphor? Or a report? You can't tell. But the rhythm of it feels strangely bureaucratic. Even more puzzling is the trail of references to something called the Silent Scroll, a legendary document said to contain the names of all those the Empire has officially forgotten, written in invisible ink, preserved in a scroll case made of whisperwood. A fictional tree said to grow only in the dreams of archivists. Okay, that part is probably satire. Probably. But you find yourself watching the shelves more carefully, wondering if somewhere, buried behind tax codes and temple blueprints, there might be something no one was ever meant to read. You ask Callistratus whether he believes the Silent Scroll exists. He just smiles and says, "You're a librarian. If it exists, you'll find it." Then he leaves, disappearing into the maze of Rome, with the slow certainty of someone who knows how to disappear well. Days pass, and life returns to its sleepy rhythm. Scrolls arrive, scrolls leave. You lose yourself in the usual repairs and indexing, but part of your mind remains tuned to the idea of memory as architecture. Something built, preserved, and occasionally demolished. You begin looking at your own notes differently. Which events did you record? Which did you let slip? Did you write about that moment with Domitia by the aqueduct, when she said she hated olives but still ate the ones you offered her, just to be polite? Did you write down that old scribe's joke about the goat that outranked a praetor because it sat in the Senate chamber longer? Or did you let those memories go, trusting they'd stay with you without ink. Maybe this is what all librarians struggle with, not the storage of memory, but the choice of what deserves to be remembered. You leave a blank scroll on your desk that evening, lit by a half-melted lamp. At the top, in tiny script, you write, "To be remembered." But the rest you leave empty, not because you have nothing to say, but because for the first time, you want to see what the scroll remembers without you. Your routine is once again interrupted, but this time not by a senator or a philosopher, or even a courier from the Imperial Census Office. No, this time it's a small child, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, who wanders into the library holding a scroll half as long as his body. His tunic is dusty, his sandals too big, and his face is the exact blend of curiosity and determination that reminds you of every new librarian before they got jaded by bureaucratic formatting errors. He says nothing at first, just stands at the edge of the doorway, watching you as if he's not sure whether you're a person or just another piece of the furniture. You pause your work, look up from your tangled scroll repairs, and give him a gentle nod. "Need help finding something?" you ask. He walks slowly forward and hands you the scroll, holding it out like a sacred object. The seal is unfamiliar, faded, wax with no crest. And the papyrus is brittle, frayed at the edges like it's been left out in the sun. When you open it, the text isn't Latin or Greek or even Egyptian. It's a strange mixture of alphabets, some of them reversed, some written in spirals or mirrored lines that make your eyes hurt. It's not gibberish, though. There's a rhythm to it, a cadence. Something about the structure reminds you of musical notation, the kind Domitia once showed you when she brought in a travelling bard's sheet music for preservation. The boy doesn't explain where he got it. He just sits down on the floor next to the shelf of rejected tax ledgers and watches you read. It takes hours. You cancel your mid-morning tasks, let your lunch go cold, and ignore 3 separate knocks at the door, including one very persistent pigeon delivery, just so you can study the thing. Eventually, you find a pattern. The scroll is a mnemonic, guide, a kind of coded memory palace, written in symbols instead of words. Historians still argue whether the Romans actually used such complex systems outside of rhetorical training, but here it is, a labyrinth of symbols meant to lead the reader, from memory to memory, like breadcrumbs through the chaos of time. The child finally speaks. "He said to bring it here," he says, eyes fixed on your face. "He said you'd know what it means." You ask him who he is, but the boy just shrugs. A man with no eyes. Charming. You consider the possibility that you're being pranked, but the scroll is too intricate, too deliberate. Even the ink seems special, slightly iridescent, shimmering faintly in candlelight, as if it refuses to sit still. There's a fringe theory, one Domitia read to you once when you were both supposed to be sorting supply lists, that some Roman scribes experimented with reflective inks made from crushed mica and bee resins. Supposedly, these inks were used for texts meant to be read only at night or during moonlit rituals. Most scholars dismiss the idea. It sounds more like alchemical fantasy than historical fact. But the scroll in your hands makes you pause. You feel like it's watching you. The symbols begin to connect. You realize the scroll isn't just a mnemonic. It's a map. Not of places, but of memories. Specifically, memories of librarians. The text leads you through a series of metaphorical rooms, a chamber of broken quills, a hallway made of voice echoes, a tower where scrolls are stacked so high they pierce the clouds. And in each space, there's a name. One you recognize, one you don't. Yours. You find your own name halfway through the scroll, listed among the keepers who remember through silence. You don't know whether to feel honored or deeply creeped out. Domitia arrives sometime later and sits beside you silently, drawn by your expression. You pass her the scroll. She reads, slowly, and when she reaches the part with her own name, because yes, it's there too, in a corner labelled, "The Laugh That Echoed Through Ash," she gives you a nervous look. "You think this is a joke?" she whispers. You shake your head. It's too old for that. Too weird for that, she mutters. Same thing, you reply. The boy eventually falls asleep beside a crate of unused index tablets, curled up like a cat. You let him rest. That night, you can't sleep. You keep replaying the symbols in your mind, mapping them mentally onto the rooms of the library, and suddenly, you realize something. The scroll matches the layout of your archive, not perfectly, but closely enough that it feels intentional. The metaphors align. The chamber of broken quills is obviously the old scriptorium where ink, spills, still stain the marble. The tower of cloud-piercing scrolls is clearly the northwest corner, where the census duplicates are stacked so high, you need a ladder to access the top shelves. It's a memory palace that's actually built on top of a real palace of memories, which means the scroll isn't just describing the past, it's describing your present. You wonder who made it. Someone who knew this place deeply. Someone who wanted you to remember something. You decide to follow it. Not metaphorically, but literally. With Demisha at your side and a handful of wax tablets to sketch with, you begin walking the archive in the order the scroll describes. Room by room, memory by memory, and in each location you find something that shouldn't be there. A broken stylus hidden in the wall crack. A note scratched behind a filing shelf. A faded diagram etched into the bottom of a neglected scroll case. One clue leads to another, and soon you're tracing a trail through history itself, your own. Personal breadcrumb path, laid down who knows how long ago, by someone who knew you'd be the one to pick it up. The final room on the scroll is marked only with a symbol, a closed eye, drawn in a single stroke. You find it deep beneath the archive in a locked subchamber neither of you remember entering before. The door creaks open. Inside, a single scroll, placed atop a pedestal. The wax seal bears the symbol from the boy's scroll. You break it. Read. It's a list of names. Your names. Everyone who's ever worked here. Everyone who's ever kept this strange, peaceful, chaotic, impossible job alive. Some are crossed out. Some are written in gold. At the bottom, one line stands out. Those who forget become the forgotten. Those who remember remain. You copy the phrase, just in case you ever forget. The next morning the boy is gone, but the scroll remains, safe in your care. You rewrap it gently and place it in the private archives, next to your own notes. You don't know who wrote it. You may never know, but somehow you're sure. This place remembers everything. Even you.